She had destroyed him once, and yet here he stood, at 3 o'clock in the morning, with rain hammering the leaded windows of Ashbourne Hall. His Grace, Edmund Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Ashbourne, knelt upon the cold stone floor of his private study and pressed a letter to his chest as though it were the last warm thing left in the world. The wax seal had been broken, not by his hand, but by another's, and the contents of that letter, the carefully written lines in a hand he had once kissed with reverence, had the power to ruin not one life, but two. He had read it twice. He was about to read it a third time. Outside, the storm had turned the Yorkshire moors into a churning black sea. Inside, the single tallow candle on the escritoire guttered in the draught that crept beneath the heavy oak door, casting shadows that danced and writhed like accusations across the book-lined walls. Edmund's jaw was set in that particular way that his valet knew to dread, the way that meant something inside the Duke had gone very, very quiet. He was not angry. That would have been simpler. He was something far more dangerous. He was resolved. The letter bore the name of Lady Cecily Hartwell, now Lady Cecily Vane, wife of Lord Arthur Vane, Baron of Skelton, mother of 2 small daughters, resident of Thornfield House, which sat not 4 miles from where Edmund now knelt. It bore her name, and it bore the name of a man called Hargrove, Mr. Silas Hargrove, a moneylender of the most predatory variety, whose interests had recently extended from the counting-houses of Leeds to the drawing-rooms of the Quality. And what the letter proposed, what it threatened, in language wrapped in the silk of civility, was the utter annihilation of everything Lady Cecily Vane had spent 5 years carefully rebuilding. Edmund closed his eyes. He did not want to think about Cecily. He had made a rather thorough art of not thinking about her for half a decade. He had attended her wedding from the very back of St. George's, Hanover Square, where a stone pillar conveniently obscured his face, and he had drunk himself into something approaching unconsciousness at his club that same evening. He had declined every dinner party at which her name appeared on the guest list. He had left London for Ashbourne whenever the social calendar conspired to place them in the same ballroom. He had been, he considered, remarkably disciplined. And now she had come to him, not in person, not yet, but through this letter, which had arrived in a sealed packet addressed to him in an unfamiliar hand, accompanied by a single line of explanation that chilled him more than the stone floor beneath his knees. "Your Grace, she does not know I am writing to you, but there is no one else." He stood, finally, and moved to the window. The candle flame steadied as he stepped away from the draught. He looked out to nothing, at absolute darkness, at rain, at the moors that had been in his family for 2 centuries, and he permitted himself, for exactly 30 seconds, to remember. He remembered a young woman in a primrose yellow gown at the Somerford ball 7 years ago, when the world was still new, and he was 24, and not yet entirely armored against hope. He remembered the evening in the Hartwell library, 2 months after their first meeting, when she had laid her hand over his and told him very quietly that she supposed she loved him. He had not been able to speak for a full minute. He had simply turned her hand over and pressed his lips to her palm, and thought that no man in England was luckier. He remembered the morning he had gone to her father's house with his formal offer of marriage, arranged, planned, rehearsed, and had been told by a tight-lipped butler that Lady Cecily was not at home. He had called the next day, and the next. On the 4th day he had received a letter, not from Cecily, from her father, Lord Hartwell. The engagement, such as it had been, an understanding, an expectation, a certainty as solid as Yorkshire limestone, was at an end. Lady Cecily was to marry Lord Vane. The matter was settled. His Grace was thanked for his interest and wished every felicity. Edmund had read that letter standing in his entrance hall, still wearing his coat and gloves. His secretary, hovering at a respectful distance, had later reported that the Duke had stood there, perfectly still and perfectly silent for nearly 20 minutes. He had never spoken to Cecily Artwell again, not until tonight. He turned from the window. He crossed to the escritoire, sat down, took a fresh sheet of paper, dipped his pen, and began to write. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the storm had passed and left the moors gleaming and washed clean, every blade of grass catching the pale October light like hammered silver. Edmund rode to Thornfield House himself. He had refused the carriage, refused his groom, refused everything that would have slowed him or given him time to reconsider. He was shown into a small morning room on the east side of the house, which smelled of dried lavender and beeswax, and very faintly of a particular rose-water scent that struck him in the chest like a physical blow. And then she came in. 5 years had changed Lady Cecily Vane in ways that were both visible and invisible. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not yet true lines, but the suggestion of them, the ghost of all the expressions her face had rehearsed in the years they had been apart. She was thinner than he remembered. Her morning gown, she had lost Lord Vane to a fever 18 months past, was of good black wool, perfectly fitted, and her dark hair was dressed simply, without ornament. She was 30 years old, and she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and Edmund hated himself for noticing. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was very steady. She had always been brave, he remembered, infuriatingly, impressively brave. "Lady Vane," he said. They stood on opposite sides of the morning room like opposing chess pieces, and the silence between them was so thick and so specific that it had the texture of something living. She spoke first. "I did not send for you." "No," Edmund agreed, "but someone who cares rather urgently for your welfare did." He watched her face change, watched the composure fracture, just slightly, like the surface of ice beginning to give. She turned and moved to the window, and he recognized the gesture as the same one she had always made when she was trying to compose herself, the slight lift of the chin, the deliberate steadying of the shoulders. "You have read the letter," she said. It was not a question. "I have." "Then you know what Hargrove intends." "I know what he claims to intend, which is to present to the Lord Chancellor a set of documents, letters in point of fact, that he alleges will demonstrate that the late Lord Vane's debts were settled not by Lord Vane himself, but through funds improperly obtained, funds that, he will argue, implicate you in a scheme of fraud." Cecily pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Outside, a pair of starlings chased each other across the pale sky. "And if he does," she said very quietly, "the scandal will not only destroy me, it will destroy my daughters. They will grow up with that name, that stain." She turned to look at him, and her dark eyes were fierce and dry and utterly, heartbreakingly proud. "I will not allow it." "No," Edmund said, "neither will I." The silence that followed was of a different quality. It had an edge to it now, confusion, wariness, something that in another woman might have been hope, and which Cecily appeared to be actively suppressing. "You have no reason," she said at last, "to involve yourself in this." Edmund allowed himself for the first time since entering the room to look at her directly and fully, not the careful glancing assessment of a man guarding himself, but the steady, unhurried regard of a man who has already decided something and is at peace with it. "No," he agreed, "I do not." "Edmund." His Christian name came out of her before she could stop it, and she flinched at her own breach of propriety. "Your Grace, I must say something to you, something that I have—" She stopped, began again. "Something that I should have said 5 years ago, and did not because I was a coward, and because my father—" "You need not." "I do." Her voice broke briefly, and she steadied it with visible effort. "I need you to know that I did not choose to end our understanding. My father had debts,
Terrible debts, debts that Lord Vane's solicitors agreed to absorb entirely in exchange for the match. I was not given a choice. I was told that if I refused, my brothers would lose everything. I was 19 years old, and I did not know how to fight it, and I was too much a coward to come to you and tell you the truth." Edmund was very still. "Why did you not tell me?" he said, and his voice was quiet and very controlled, which meant it was concealing something vast. "Because I thought—" She pressed her hand to her sternum, a small involuntary gesture of pain. "I thought you would try to save me, and I could not bear to be the cause of whatever it would have cost you." The morning room was entirely silent, save for the distant coo of wood pigeons and the creak of the old house settling. Edmund crossed the room in 4 deliberate strides, stopped 2 feet from her, and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she would later describe to no one, because there were no words in her vocabulary adequate to it. "And now," he said, "you are in need of saving again. I am not asking—" "You are not asking," I agreed. "You never did ask. That was always the difficulty with you, Cecily." His name was quiet and deliberate, and she felt it like a hand pressed gently against a wound. Something in her cracked then, not dramatically, not in the fashion of a tree struck by lightning, but in the slow, private way of a thing that has been under unbearable pressure for a long time and had finally been given permission to yield. "What are you proposing to do?" she whispered. "Hargrove's documents," Edmund said, moving back to the escritoire in the corner of the room and setting down the leather satchel he had carried in, which she had not until now registered, "are forgeries, possible ones, but forgeries nonetheless. I have spent the better part of last night examining the particulars of the hand, the paper, the dates. My solicitors in London are, as of 6 o'clock this morning, in possession of evidence that will demonstrate conclusively that Hargrove himself orchestrated the very financial irregularity he now threatens to expose, and that he has attempted this precise maneuver against 3 other families in the last 4 years. Cecily stared at him. "You were awake all night," she said slowly. "I was. Working on this. Yes. For me." He looked at her with that quiet, steady gaze that she had spent 5 years trying to forget. "You have 2 daughters," he said simply, "and you have done nothing wrong." Cecily sat down, quite suddenly, in the nearest chair. Not from weakness. She was not, as she would have been the first to inform anyone, a woman given to weakness, but because her legs had simply made a decision independent of her will. "I need you to understand," she said at last, "that if you do this, if you expose Hargrove and stand as my advocate in this, the connection will be remarked upon. People will talk. They will remember that we were—" She paused. "They will speculate." "Let them," Edmund said. "Your reputation is entirely adequate to withstand speculation." He almost smiled then, just barely, just at one corner of his mouth, and she remembered, with a violence that surprised her, that she had once been very much in love with that particular almost smile. "Cecily, I have spent 5 years being very careful to want nothing that I cannot have. I am profoundly tired of it." The room was very bright now, the October sun having climbed high enough to pour through the east-facing windows and illuminate everything with a quality of light that seemed to both of them almost indecent in its clarity. "And after," Cecily said softly, "after Hargrove is dealt with and the scandal is averted and your solicitors have done their work, what then?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "depends entirely on you." The matter of Silas Hargrove was resolved with a quietness that befitted its sensitivity and a speed that reflected the Duke of Ashbourne's considerable influence. The documents were demonstrated to be fraudulent. Hargrove, confronted with the evidence assembled by Edmund's solicitors and threatened with criminal prosecution, departed Yorkshire with remarkable alacrity and was not seen in the county again. 2 subsequent accounts emerged from families he had similarly targeted that rendered his credibility in London permanently and entirely defunct. Lady Cecily Vane received no letter from the Lord Chancellor. Her daughters remained ignorant of the danger that had briefly circled their small, peaceful lives like a hawk over summer fields. The household at Thornfield House continued outwardly as it had been. But Edmund called again on a Tuesday, and then on a Thursday, and then with somewhat less ceremony and rather more frequency, whenever the distance between Ashbourne Hall and Thornfield House seemed, for no particular reason he could articulate, inconveniently large. He brought books the first time, a volume of Mr. Scott's verse that he had been meaning to lend for years, he said, and this was not entirely untrue. He brought his thoughts about the estate drainage the second time, which interested Cecily not at all, but which gave him 40 minutes in her morning room, during which she served him excellent coffee and argued with him about the management of tenant cottages with a fire and precision that made him feel for the first time in a long time something very much like joy. By the fourth visit they had ceased requiring pretexts. She told him one afternoon in November, when the frost had traced its silver patterns across the window glass, and the fire had burned low, and neither of them had moved to build it higher, exactly what had passed through her mind on the morning she had realized she was to be given to Lord Vane. She described the way she had sat at her dressing table and looked at her own face in the glass, and told herself very firmly that she would survive it, that she would build something good and quiet and sufficient, that she would not allow herself the luxury of grief. "And did it work?" he asked. "For the most part," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire's dying light. "I am not a man who finds it easy to trust again. I want you to know that. I want you to know it not as a reproach, it is not intended as one, but because you deserve my honesty, and my honesty includes the fact that there are parts of me that were broken, Cecily, 5 years ago, and that I have not been entirely able to repair." She met his gaze steadily. "I know," she said, "and I want you to know that I am aware of what it cost you to come to Thornfield House, to do what you did, she stopped, to choose again to care about what happens to me after I gave you every reason not to." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has thought very carefully about a thing and is absolutely certain.
"You gave me every reason not to care," he said, "and I found, upon examination, that the reasons did not signify." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, softly and without announcement, as if the world had decided to be gentle for once. It settled on the window-sills of Thornfield House, and on the dark moors beyond, and on the long road back to Ashbourne Hall, which Edmund did not travel that evening. He stayed for dinner, and when he finally departed, well past the hour at which any call could be considered proper or advisable, he paused in the doorway of the morning-room and looked at her in the candlelight, at the brightness in her dark eyes and the small private smile that she was not quite managing to suppress, and he felt something in his chest do something he had long since stopped expecting. It opened. The engagement was announced in the Morning Post on the 14th of December, and it caused precisely the quantity of sensation that both parties had anticipated and neither party particularly cared about. The Duchess of Rutland declared it terribly romantic. Lady Sefton said she had always thought they would find their way to one another eventually. Lord Hartwell, from whom Cecily had been coolly estranged for some years, sent a letter of congratulation that was not acknowledged. The ceremony was held on the 1st of February at the small medieval church on the Ashbourne estate, in the presence of the household staff, a handful of intimate friends, and 2 small dark-haired girls who wore their best white dresses and considered the entire proceeding with the grave, evaluating attention of children who have learned not to trust new things too readily. Edmund had not been nervous about many things in his 31 years of life. He had faced down creditors, parliamentary debates, 2 separate dueling challenges, and a remarkably aggressive pheasant on the South Lawn in the autumn of 1816. He stood at the altar and found to his mild surprise that his hands were not entirely steady.
Cecily arrived on the arm of her eldest brother, a reconciliation that, hard-won and still fragile, but a beginning, and she wore a gown the colour of winter cream and carried snowdrops, which were Edmund's favourite flower, and which she had remembered from a conversation they had had 7 years ago in the Hartwell garden, a detail so small and so precise that when he saw them he could not speak for a moment. He thought, standing there, of all the years that had been lost, the distance they had carried between them like a wound neither would acknowledge, the letters never written, the words never said, the 1,000 small moments of a shared life that had simply not happened. And then he thought, they are happening now. The service was brief, and the vicar was kind, and when Edmund took Cecily's hand at the altar, it was warm and it was steady, and it held his with a firmness that said very clearly and without a single word, I am not going anywhere, not this time, not ever. After the congratulations and the cold champagne and the wedding breakfast in the great hall, with the firelight on the old stone and the children asleep upstairs and the snow coming down outside in earnest now, thick and white and hushing the entire world into a kind of tenderness, after all of it, they found themselves alone, standing before the library fire at Ashbourne Hall, and there was a silence between them, but it was not the silence of 5 years ago, not the silence of things unsaid and wounds unhealed. It was the silence of 2 people who are finally, improbably, irrevocably home. You sacrificed your pride, Cecily said, your certainty, 5 years of very careful self-protection. Yes, Edmund said. Was it worth it? He looked at her fully, the way he had looked at her in the morning room that October day, without armor or reservation, or the careful distance of a man who has been hurt and has not forgotten it. Ask me again in 40 years, and I will give you an accounting. But my present estimation is, and here, finally, the almost smile became the real one, wide and unguarded, and younger than she had seen him look in years, considerably in the affirmative. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unpolished, delighted, the laugh of a woman who has carried something very heavy for a long time, and at last has been permitted to set it down. And in the library at Ashbourne Hall, while the snow fell and the fire burned, and the house settled around them with the deep, contented quiet of a place that has been waiting a long time for exactly this, the Duke of Ashbourne pressed his lips to the temple of his Duchess, and thought that there was not in all the wide world a luckier man alive. They say that love, at its truest, is not a feeling, but a choice, made not once in the first flush of ardour, but again and again in the cold light of morning, in the aftermath of betrayal, in the long quiet years when the easy warmth has faded and only the steady, deliberate flame remains. Edmund chose, in spite of every reason not to, in spite of pride and pain, and the very reasonable conviction that a man who has been broken once ought to protect his remaining wholeness with some care. He chose. And in choosing, in kneeling on that cold stone floor at 3 in the morning, with a stranger's letter pressed against his chest, and the storm howling outside, and all his careful armor finally irrevocably giving way, he saved not only the woman he loved, he saved himself.